She was already leaving the valley when one strange sight beside a cowboy's ranch made her pull the reins and look twice. A wooden chest slams onto the courthouse table. Papers spill across the room. Snow melts from boots onto the floorboards as every head turns toward the woman standing in the doorway. Outside, the wind rattles the windows. Across the room, a cowboy grips the back of a chair without taking his eyes off her. No one speaks. Then the sheriff reaches for the first document, and suddenly, the entire valley seems to stop breathing. But what brought her to this moment began months earlier with a dusty road and a field of flowers no one could explain. If stories of love, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, stay with us and let us know where you're watching from. The last thing Josephine Brooks loaded into the wagon was her sewing machine. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. She stood for a moment beside the wagon bed, one hand resting on the worn wooden frame, catching her breath while the morning wind moved through the dry grass along the road. Bittergrass Valley stretched around her beneath a pale Montana sky. 3 years. 3 years of stitching dresses, mending coats, shortening trousers, and saving every spare coin she could manage. 3 years that now fit into a wagon. The shop bell above Walker & Son Tailoring had barely stopped ringing after Mrs. Walker's funeral, before her son had begun making changes. The first change had been Josephine. He said the business belonged to him now. He said her records were incomplete. He said her wages had already been generous. Then he locked the office cabinet and informed her she was no longer needed. Just like that. No shouting, no fight, only a closed door. Josephine climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. The mule started forward. Dust rose behind the wheels. By noon she had passed 2 ranches, a cattle camp, and a creek nearly dry from summer heat. The road toward Helena wound through open country where the grass looked gold beneath the sun. She told herself she was relieved. She told herself she was finally free. The trouble was, she didn't feel free. She felt tired. Late in the afternoon, she reached the eastern ridge overlooking the valley. That was when she saw it. Josephine pulled the reins so suddenly the mule tossed its head. Below her sat a modest ranch surrounded by ordinary pasture land. But along one side of the property, color exploded across the landscape. Wildflowers, thousands of them. Red, blue, yellow, purple. The blooms stretched beside the fence line like a painted river flowing through dry Montana earth. For a long moment, she simply stared. Every other ranch in the valley looked built for cattle. This one looked built for living. The wind carried the movement of the flowers across the field in soft waves. Josephine glanced down the road toward Helena, then back toward the flowers. She shook her head. The mule needed water, she decided. That was all. Nothing more. A few minutes later, she guided the wagon through the open ranch gate. A black and white dog lifted its head from beneath the porch and watched her approach. Somewhere behind the barn came the sound of a hammer striking wood. Josephine stepped down from the wagon. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with wildflowers in the warm air. She followed the sound. A man stood beside a fence post repairing a gate hinge. He wore a faded brown shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows and a weathered hat pushed back from his forehead. When he heard her footsteps, he turned. Not startled, not suspicious, just attentive. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was calm. Josephine adjusted her gloves. "Afternoon. I was passing through. My mule could use some water." "You're welcome to it." He pointed toward a trough beside the barn. "There's fresh water from the well." "Thank you." The mule drank while Josephine filled a tin cup for herself. The water was cold enough to surprise her. When she lowered the cup, she found the man standing nearby, not crowding her, just waiting in case she needed something else. "I'm Josephine Brooks," she said. "Gavin Mercer." She nodded. Then her eyes drifted back toward the sea of flowers. I hope you don't mind me asking something. Not at all. Why all the flowers? His gaze followed hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze moved through the blooms again. Finally, he smiled faintly. My father used to say that if land only produced money and nothing beautiful, then it wasn't a home yet. Josephine looked at the flowers, then at the man beside them. Something settled quietly inside her. Not certainty, not trust. Just the smallest crack in a wall she had spent years building. The road to Helena still waited beyond the ridge, but when she climbed back onto her wagon a little later, she found herself looking over her shoulder one last time at the field of color beside Gavin Mercer's ranch. And for the first time since losing everything, she wasn't entirely sure if she wanted to leave Bittergrass Valley behind. The road to Helena remained exactly where it had always been. Josephine never reached it. 3 days later, she rented a small room above Edith Walker's boarding house near the center of town. The room was narrow but clean. A brass bed stood beneath a window overlooking Main Street. A wash basin sat on a wooden stand in the corner. The wallpaper was fading around the edges, and one floorboard creaked whenever she crossed it. It felt temporary. That was the point. Just a few weeks, she told herself. Long enough to earn a little money. Long enough to decide what came next. Edith Walker found sewing work for her almost immediately. A ranch wife needed curtains repaired. A school teacher needed 2 dresses altered. A cattle buyer wanted 3 shirts patched before winter. The work wasn't glamorous, but Josephine welcomed the rhythm of it. Needle, thread, scissors, measure, stitch. The familiar motions steadied her thoughts. On Saturday morning, she found herself riding south out of town. She told herself she needed fresh air. The fact that the road led directly toward Gavin Mercer's ranch was purely accidental. At least that was the story she chose. The black and white dog met her at the gate this time. His tail wagged once before he trotted ahead toward the barn. Gavin was repairing a saddle beneath the shade of an old cottonwood. Leather tools lay neatly arranged beside him. He glanced up as she approached. Miss Brooks, Mr. Mercer. You found your way back. Looks that way. His mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. The saddle needed a new stirrup strap. Josephine watched him work for a moment. His hands moved with practiced confidence. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Most people rushed things. Gavin didn't. After a while, he stood and disappeared into the house. When he returned, he carried 2 tin cups. Coffee? Josephine accepted one. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. She liked it immediately. They stood beside the barn, drinking in comfortable silence. No awkward questions. No interrogation about her plans. No curiosity disguised as politeness. The silence surprised her most. Many people filled silence because it made them nervous. Gavin seemed perfectly willing to let it exist. She found herself returning the following week. Then again after that. The visits acquired small purposes. One afternoon she repaired a tear in his winter coat. Another day she brought him a novel someone had left behind at the boarding house. A week later he returned it and handed her another book in exchange. Neither mentioned that the trades were becoming a habit. September arrived with cooler mornings. The mountains beyond Bittergrass Valley began collecting early snow along their highest ridges. One evening, a storm rolled through unexpectedly. Hard rain, sharp wind. A small ranch north of town lost part of its cattle herd when a fence gave way near the creek. The next morning, Gavin rode out with 3 neighboring ranchers to help gather the scattered animals. Josephine happened to be helping Edith deliver supplies to the family. By sunset, she watched Gavin ride back into the yard soaked to the skin and covered in mud. One exhausted calf stood tied behind his horse. Nobody thanked him loudly. Nobody made a speech. The ranch family simply opened their gate and welcomed the calf home. Gavin nodded once and rode away. That stayed with her. Some people performed kindness. Others simply did it. A few days later, they sat on the porch steps outside the ranch house, drinking coffee as the sun dropped behind the hills. The flower field glowed gold beneath the evening light. For a while, neither spoke. Then Josephine noticed wagon tracks approaching from the road. A polished carriage rolled through the gate. The woman who stepped down wore an expensive riding dress, trimmed in green. Amelia Grant. Josephine recognized her immediately. Nearly everyone in Bittergrass knew the banker's daughter. Amelia smiled when she saw Gavin. The smile suggested familiarity, the kind built over years. Gavin. Miss Grant. Amelia's gaze briefly moved to Josephine. Pleasant? Polite? Measured? Father wanted me to remind you about next week's social dance. I'll be there. Good. Because sooner or later, somebody in this valley has to become Mrs. Mercer. Amelia laughed lightly. The joke seemed intended for everyone. No one laughed with her. Gavin merely looked toward the pasture. The silence stretched. Eventually, Amelia climbed back into the carriage and left. Josephine stared into her coffee. The cup had gone cold. Gavin said nothing. Perhaps there was nothing to say. The following Saturday, the dance hall glowed with lantern light. Music drifted through open windows. Cowboys in pressed shirts crowded the floor. Women in bright dresses moved between tables. Josephine stood near the back wall beside Edith Walker. She spotted Gavin across the room. Then he spotted Amelia. The banker's daughter seemed perfectly comfortable standing beside him, laughing, talking, belonging. Josephine watched for a moment longer than she intended. Something inside her settled heavily. Not anger, not jealousy. Just a quiet disappointment she hadn't expected. Without speaking to anyone, she slipped out through the side door. The night air felt cool after the crowded hall. She walked slowly back toward town beneath a sky full of stars. Behind her, the music continued. Ahead of her, the boarding house lamp burned softly in the darkness. And for the first time since turning her wagon around beside a field of flowers, Josephine realized she had started hoping for something she had never planned to want. Autumn settled over Bittergrass Valley one slow day at a time. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold first. Then the mornings grew colder. Frost appeared on fence rails before sunrise and disappeared by breakfast. Josephine threw herself into work. She mended wool coats for winter. She hemmed dresses by lamplight. She balanced receipts and counted coins carefully before placing them inside a small wooden box beneath her bed. Life continued. Yet somehow Gavin Mercer seemed to appear in it more often. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. A borrowed book returned with a folded page marking a passage he thought she would like. A sack of apples left at Edith Walker's boarding house after a rancher delivered too many. A repaired wagon wheel after Gavin noticed hers leaning crooked against the stable. None of it came with speeches. None of it demanded gratitude. The gestures simply existed, like the flowers. One cold October afternoon, Josephine was helping Edith unload supplies from a freight wagon when she noticed a crowd gathering outside the bank. Men stood talking in low voices, hats pulled low, faces serious. Something was wrong. By evening, everyone in town seemed to know. A railroad survey crew had been spotted 50 miles east. The rumor spread through Bittergrass faster than wildfire through dry grass. A railroad meant money, land, growth, new businesses, new buyers. Every acre suddenly mattered, especially the ranches surrounding the valley. A few days later, Josephine saw another change. Ranchers began visiting Silas Grant's bank. Some emerged looking troubled, others angry. One old rancher folded a document and shoved it into his coat pocket before climbing onto his wagon with a face gray as winter clouds. Edith noticed it too. "Something's brewing," she said one evening while peeling potatoes in the boarding house kitchen. "The railroad?" "The bank," Edith replied. "The railroad is only the excuse." Josephine thought about that. A week later, she found herself riding toward Gavin's ranch. The flower field had begun preparing for winter. Many blooms were gone now. The colors softer, the stems taller and dry. Yet the place remained beautiful. Gavin stood near the barn speaking with 3 neighboring ranchers. Maps were spread across a crate, documents weighted down by horseshoes. The conversation stopped when she approached, not because she wasn't welcome, because important matters were being discussed. One of the ranchers tipped his hat politely. After they left, Josephine glanced toward the papers. "Trouble?" "Maybe." Gavin folded the documents. "Silas Grant wants people selling before they know what their land is worth. And they're listening? Some are scared enough to." He looked toward the distant hills. "A bad season can make a man desperate." Josephine studied him quietly. "What will you do?" "Help them keep what belongs to them." The answer came without hesitation, as though there had never been another option. A week later, Gavin sold 20 head of cattle earlier than planned. The price wasn't good. Everyone knew it. When Josephine asked why, he shrugged. The Morrison family needed help paying a lawyer. If they lose their claim, they lose their ranch. The statement was delivered as casually as discussing weather. Josephine stared at him. "You sold cattle for someone else's legal fees?" "Someone did the same for my father once." He picked up a bucket and headed toward the well. "Sometimes you pay things forward." She watched him walk away. The wind moved through the dry flowers. The valley trusted him. Now she understood why. By November, the first snow dusted the mountain peaks. The railroad rumors continued. The bank grew busier. And so did the gossip. It began quietly. A glance. A whisper. A conversation that stopped when Josephine entered a room. Then came the cancellations. Mrs. Pritchard withdrew an order for winter curtains. A ranch wife who had commissioned 2 dresses suddenly claimed she had changed her mind. Another customer never returned. At first, Josephine dismissed it. Then Edith handed her a folded note one evening. No signature, only a message. It suggested Josephine had become very interested in Gavin Mercer's future. The handwriting was neat. The meaning was not. Josephine folded the paper, set it beside her coffee, and said nothing. The next day, another customer canceled, then another. 3 days later, she entered the general store and noticed 2 women lower their voices when she approached. The realization arrived slowly. Then, all at once, someone was talking. Someone was feeding the town a story, and the story was spreading. Late one afternoon, Josephine passed Amelia Grant near the church. Amelia wore a new riding coat trimmed with fur. Her smile arrived before her greeting. "Miss Brooks, Miss Grant, I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time at the Mercer Ranch." Josephine met her eyes. "I visit friends when invited." "Of course." Amelia's smile never moved. Small towns notice things. Then she walked away. Josephine stood alone beside the church fence. The cold wind tugged at her coat. Behind her, the church bell rang the hour. For the first time since arriving in Bittergrass Valley, she felt something shift beneath her feet. Not in her friendship with Gavin. Not yet. But in the town around them. And as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Josephine understood a difficult truth. Someone had decided she didn't belong in the story people imagined for Gavin Mercer. and that someone was determined to make the whole valley believe it. Winter arrived early that year. By the first week of December, snow sat in the shadows beneath the cottonwoods and lingered along the north sides of buildings. Smoke drifted from chimneys across town each morning, hanging low in the cold air before disappearing into the pale Montana sky. Josephine kept working, or tried to. The stack of sewing orders on her table grew smaller each week, not because she was working faster, because fewer people were bringing work. One afternoon, she sat by the window of her room above Edith Walker's boarding house, mending a wool coat beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp. Outside, a wagon rolled past through fresh snow. Inside, the room felt unusually quiet. A knock sounded at her door. Edith entered carrying a tray with coffee and cornbread. She placed it gently beside the sewing machine. Neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Edith sighed. "It's getting worse." Josephine nodded. She already knew. The silence between customers had become impossible to ignore. "Some folks listen too easily," Edith said, "especially when gossip sounds more exciting than truth." Josephine folded the coat carefully. "The truth usually catches up eventually." Edith smiled sadly. "I hope so." A few days later, another rumor swept through town. This one had nothing to do with Josephine. At first, Silas Grant had officially challenged several ranch claims near Bittergrass Creek, including Gavin Mercer's. The news traveled quickly. Men gathered outside the feed store, inside the barber shop, around the stove at the general store. Every conversation eventually led to the same question. Could Gavin lose his ranch? Josephine rode to the Mercer property the following Sunday. Snow covered much of the flower field now. Only a few dry stalks remained visible above the white blanket. Yet Gavin still walked the rows, checking them, protecting them, planning for spring. He stood beside a fence post when she arrived. His face looked more tired than she had ever seen it. "The bank filed formal papers," he said. Josephine stepped down from her horse. "Can they do that?" Apparently. He handed her a folded document. The paper crackled in the cold air. Legal language filled the page. Survey disputes, boundary questions, title irregularities. Words designed to sound complicated. Words designed to frighten. "This isn't about land records," Josephine said quietly. "No, it isn't." "The railroad." He nodded. "The railroad." Neither spoke for a moment. The wind moved across the frozen field. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. "What happens now?" "There's a hearing in town after New Year's." Josephine folded the paper. "And if they win?" Gavin glanced toward the house, then toward the hills beyond his pasture. "Then I start over." The answer came calmly, too calmly. That somehow made it worse. January arrived beneath heavy clouds. Snowstorms rolled through the valley every few days. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Josephine was helping Edith clear storage shelves in the back room of the boarding house. Dust covered everything. Old ledgers, boxes, broken lamps, abandoned furniture. Against the far wall sat a small cedar chest. Edith paused. That belonged to Mrs. Walker, the former owner. Josephine knelt beside it. The brass latch stuck at first, then released. Inside were papers. Dozens of them. Receipts, contracts, letters, property records, years of forgotten business documents tied together with fading ribbon. "They should probably be sorted," Edith said. Josephine nodded and began reading. One paper became 5. 5 became 20. Then suddenly she stopped. Her fingers tightened around a folded contract. "What is it?" Edith asked. Josephine didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the page again, then again. The signature, the dates, the property descriptions, the names. A second document confirmed it, then a third, and a fourth. Her pulse quickened. Edith, I think you need to look at this. For 2 hours, they sat at the table surrounded by papers. Outside, snow fell steadily. Inside, a different storm gathered. Land transfers, bank agreements, witness statements, records stretching back years. One name appeared over and over. Silas Grant. The pieces began fitting together. Not mistakes, patterns. A pattern large enough to matter. The hearing took place 2 weeks later inside the town meeting hall. Every bench was full. Ranchers crowded the aisles. Sheriff Cole Ramsey stood near the back wall. Silas Grant sat confidently beside 2 lawyers. Amelia occupied the front row. Gavin stood alone at his table. Josephine arrived late. The cedar chest rode in the back of Edith's wagon. As she entered, the hearing was already underway. One lawyer spoke, then another. Maps covered tables. Documents changed hands. Arguments filled the room. Slowly, painfully. Silas appeared to be winning. Several ranchers lowered their heads. A few quietly left. Then Josephine carried the cedar chest through the front doors. The room fell silent. Gavin turned. Their eyes met. For one brief second, neither moved. Then Josephine crossed the room. Sheriff Ramsey stepped forward. Miss Brooks, I believe these records belong in this hearing. The sheriff opened the chest. One document became 10. 10 became 20. The lawyers stopped smiling. Questions changed. Voices lowered. An hour later, Sheriff Ramsey held up a contract and compared signatures from multiple records. His expression hardened. Then came the discovery no one expected. Several signatures had been copied. Not witnessed. Not legitimate. The evidence sat plainly on the table, visible to everyone. The room erupted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just dozens of shocked voices speaking at once. Silas Grant's face lost all color. Amelia stared at her father as if seeing him clearly for the first time. By sunset, the hearing was over. The challenge against Gavin's land collapsed. Additional investigations began immediately. Sheriff Ramsey escorted Silas from the building. No handcuffs, no spectacle, just a quiet walk through a crowd that suddenly stepped aside. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the lantern light. People stood silently along the boardwalk, watching, processing, trying to understand what had happened. Josephine remained near the courthouse steps. The cold air stung her cheeks. Across the street, Gavin stood beside his horse. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to cross the distance between them, then stopped. The valley around them seemed strangely still. The battle was over. The ranch was safe. The truth had finally arrived. Yet standing there beneath the falling snow, Josephine felt something unexpected. Not relief. Not yet. Only the quiet certainty that a different decision was waiting for her. And before winter ended, she would have to make it. The snow stayed deep across Bittergrass Valley through most of January. The hearing became the only thing people talked about for weeks. Folks who had avoided Josephine now greeted her on the boardwalk. Customers returned to her sewing room. 2 ranch wives even brought pies as if baked goods might erase months of silence. Josephine accepted their kindness politely. But something inside her had changed. Not hardened, just settled, like snow after a storm. The world no longer felt uncertain. It felt clear. Silas Grant's troubles continued. Investigators from Helena arrived twice before February ended. The bank changed hands. Amelia Grant left town shortly afterward to stay with relatives in Bozeman. No dramatic farewell. One morning, her family's house stood empty. By spring, people were already speaking of other things. That was how towns worked. Life moved forward. The mountains began releasing winter. Snowmelt fed the creeks. The first meadowlarks returned. Brown hills slowly turned green again. At Gavin Mercer's ranch, the flower field woke from its long sleep. Tiny shoots pushed through dark soil. New growth appeared where winter had seemed to erase everything. Josephine visited less often now, not because she wanted to, because she was preparing to leave. Again. Her sewing business had recovered. She had money saved. She had options. And yet every time she packed a trunk or folded a dress into a travel crate, something felt unfinished. One afternoon in late April, she sat at the small desk in her room staring at a train timetable from Helena. The paper remained untouched for nearly an hour. Finally, she folded it and slipped it into a drawer. That evening, she told Edith Walker, "I'm leaving after the spring market." Edith looked up from her knitting. "Are you?" Josephine smiled faintly. "That's the plan." Edith studied her for several seconds. Then she returned to her knitting. "Well, sometimes plans survive reality. Sometimes they don't." The comment lingered longer than Josephine expected. A week later, she saddled her horse and rode south. The afternoon sky was clear. The mountains stood blue against the horizon. The flower field had begun blooming again. Color spread across the ranch like a promise being kept. Josephine dismounted beside the gate. She hadn't sent word, hadn't planned a visit, yet Gavin seemed unsurprised to see her, as though he had expected her all along. He stood near the field, wearing a faded work shirt and carrying a shovel over one shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze moved softly through the flowers. "I heard you're leaving," he said. "News travels fast. It usually does around here." Josephine looked across the field. "Everything worked out. Your ranch is safe. The valley's safe. People have stopped talking. Most people. Most people." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Then silence returned. A comfortable silence. The kind they had always shared. Finally, Gavin set the shovel aside. "Come with me." He led her toward the eastern edge of the field, farther than she had ever walked before. Past the rows of familiar flowers. Past the old fence line. Toward a section she had never noticed. There, growing in neat rows, stood dozens of young blooms preparing to open. Josephine stopped. She recognized them immediately. The flowers had pale blue petals surrounding bright centers. "My mother loved these," she whispered. "I remember." Her eyes moved toward him. "You remember? You told me last fall, one evening on the porch. You said your mother used to grow them outside your window." Josephine stared at the flowers. There were hundreds. "You planted all these?" "Last winter." The words settled gently between them. "Why?" Gavin looked toward the field, toward the ranch, toward the mountains beyond. Then back at her. "Because I wanted something here that belonged to you." For a long moment, Josephine couldn't speak. The wind moved through the blossoms. A hawk circled high above the valley. Somewhere near the barn, a gate creaked softly. Then Gavin surprised her again. "The first day you came here," Josephine looked up. "I saw you before you ever reached the gate." "You did?" "I was repairing fence along the western pasture." He smiled. "I watched a wagon stop on the ridge. You sat there for a while, then started riding again, then stopped, then turned around." Josephine laughed softly despite herself. "I remember." I kept wondering who you were." He looked down briefly, then back at her. "And for months afterward, I kept wondering if you'd come back." Something tightened in her throat. Not painfully, just enough. The truth was suddenly simple. Neither of them had turned away. Not really, not since the beginning. Gavin took one slow step closer. "I don't want you to feel like you're only passing through this place." His voice remained calm, steady. The same voice she had heard beside a water trough nearly a year earlier. "I don't want you to be a visitor." Josephine held his gaze. The valley around them seemed impossibly quiet. Even the wind felt distant. Gavin reached into his pocket. A small velvet box appeared in his hand. "I want this to be your home." When he opened it, sunlight caught the ring inside. Simple, elegant. A small stone set in silver. Exactly the sort of thing he would choose. Nothing excessive, nothing false. Only honest. Just like him. Josephine felt tears threaten for the first time in many months. Not because she was sad, because she suddenly understood something. The day she stopped on that ridge, she thought she had found a field of flowers. What she had really found was a future. "Yes, Gavin," she said quietly. The smile that crossed his face began slowly, then grew, and somehow that smile felt more beautiful than the flowers surrounding them. They married 6 weeks later beneath an open Montana sky. Edith Walker attended. Sheriff Cole Ramsey stood beside Gavin. Several ranch families filled the rows of chairs. The ceremony was small, simple. Exactly right. Years later, trains crossed Bittergrass Valley. The town grew, businesses expanded. The Mercer Ranch prospered. Children ran through the flower fields every spring. One afternoon, a wagon stopped on the same ridge where Josephine had once paused. A young woman stared down at the sea of color below. Josephine watched from her porch. Beside her sat Gavin. The years had touched both of them kindly. The woman on the ridge remained there for several moments, just looking, just wondering. Josephine smiled, because she knew exactly what the woman was feeling. Every good thing in her life had begun with a single decision. A tired woman, a dusty road, a field of flowers, and one moment when she chose to turn around. When I think about Josephine's story, I don't really think about the flowers first. I think about that road, that long stretch of dust and uncertainty where she believed she was leaving everything behind. Maybe you've stood on a road like that yourself. Maybe not a road in Montana. Maybe not with a wagon or a horse. But a moment when you felt exhausted, disappointed, or ready to walk away from a chapter of your life. A moment when you were certain there was nothing left waiting for you if you stayed. And yet sometimes life places something small in front of us. Not a miracle, not a grand sign. Just a quiet reason to pause. A conversation, a kindness, a person who sees us clearly. Josephine didn't find happiness because she went looking for it. She found it because she gave herself permission to stop running long enough to recognize it when it appeared. Maybe that's the lesson hidden beneath all those flowers. Healing rarely arrives with a trumpet blast. More often, it comes softly. It grows the way roots grow beneath winter ground, out of sight, unnoticed, until one day you realize something beautiful has been there all along. I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever made one small decision that changed the direction of your life? Share it in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that hope can still grow in unexpected places, I hope you'll stay a while. There are many more journeys waiting ahead, stories of love, second chances, courage, and the quiet moments that shape a life long after the dust settles.